All right, it is 7:30 on the dot, my time. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker today, Matthew Wright, the author of a new book called The Evolution of Products and Packaging. Matthew has spent over 20 years in the packaging industry and is also the founder and CEO of Spec, the industry's leading specification data management platform. And my name is Jill Coopershuk. I'm the Senior Marketing Associate at Spec and will be moderating the Q&A. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to Matthew.
Great, thank you, Jill, and thank you for that nice introduction. Excited to be part of the AIPIA process today, and excited to talk about something that's certainly near and dear to my heart, which is data and packaging. You know, the transformation of data from packaging is definitely coming through digitization, which we're going to talk about today. Just a quick step back. I spent most of my career, if not all of it, in packaging, just like many on the call today. And one thing that I could see, whether it was chocolate mints being made or cars processed, chickens processed, or missiles made, is that there was really no common language for specifications, not just between company to company, but even intercompany and departments and silos around data. So there was no common language. And so I always liken that to if you had a project and you had 12 different languages, it would be really hard to get anything done. I think more of an advent of technology in the day, there was no easy way to share this data. And ultimately, what really caused big upsetness is bad specs, creating a bad product or waste, creating lost revenue, and certainly upset customers. And that's what created or urged me to create something called specification management. To me, everything's a spec. How everything connects is really bound to the DNA level of product, and then you connect them to create finished goods. So for instance, in packaging, you might have a bottle. You could have a bottle, the label, the cap, the closure, the outer packaging, the pallet, the shrink film. All of those to me are individual specs that need to be treated differently and digitized and then brought together to create product. What's amazing even today with technology is that most of this data is in Excel, shared drives, and email. We did this survey about a year ago with Chainalytics, and it showed that 64% of specs are changing very often. Today, I believe that number is probably closer to 75% or 80. And what was really scary was 85% of these changes or these specifications, method of transportation was email. Some people said it took 400 to 600 emails to get a product to market or to change a product mid-market. And we know that supply chain challenges today will not allow that. What was really mind-boggling to me is that I met just some of the most amazing people, like the people on the call today, that were well-educated, well-trained, and really had tremendous value, and yet they were spent time looking for data. We work with 7 of the top universities in the country, and what we find is that these students go to the world, and what they end up doing is looking at spreadsheets and chasing samples down. Never today is digitization of data and packaging more important than ever. You look at, and we think we can all relate to this, the explosion of SKUs, and you can't do this without data and good data. You look at just the regulatory sustainability requirements, EPR, which is coming around the world today. All this needs data. We want and we understand the supply chain complexities today like never before. We know with hundreds of ships sitting off of the Los Angeles port and all that around the world that you have to have great analytics. Everybody wants analytics, but they don't understand. You have to digitize first, and packaging is so ripe for an opportunity to digitize. And lastly, to kind of in alignment with that, you have to have great supply chain visibility. You have to know what country something's coming from, and if you have to resource that product, where you can go. You have to know if you have a problem with a certain ingredient or certain type of packaging, what does it affect? What SKUs does it affect? And all that's done through digitization. I think the most important thing coming from the industry and coming into technology and surrounding myself with some of the best technologists there are in the world, you have to understand how to speak the language of computers and then provide that to people so that it's very easily used. And so we look at digitizing specifications into a common language, a common format, so that when you amalgamate all that data, it says something to you and you can look for trends and opportunities to do things better. So we can't just put it back in spreadsheets and make it look better. It literally has to be digitized in the modern world. And that will allow for great outcomes, and we'll talk about a little bit later, such as the breaking down of individual components and not duplicating them, but linking them to create product. So what's the roadmap and really the heart of this conversation? The first step is you have to digitize. Then you have to map, operationalize, and ultimately network that data. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the first step is digitization. You cannot skip past this point. I think a lot of people try to find point solutions downstream with skipping the most critical part, which is digitization. That might mean that your data is coming from 4, 5, 6, 7 different sources, but there's a methodology to bring that data into a standard format or standard language. Until you do that, the downstream opportunities really are limited. And as I mentioned before, you have to do that at the very baseline level of specifications that capture everything. So in this case, this is a folding carton. That core folding carton, maybe different graphics, is not duplicated, rather linked and shared with other products it resides with. And then ultimately, what happens is, as I mentioned before, if you have some sort of issue, some sort of opportunity, you know exactly where that core product is being used throughout your organization. The second most important step is mapping that data. So you have to understand, as I just mentioned, where that data touches. You don't, and what we find many times is there's thousands of specs and really there's only hundreds, because people don't understand that you really need to map once you have that digitized spec. You have to relate everywhere that it touches so that you can have great analytics and great outcomes from that. And that, again, is a process to do that. And ultimately, this is the outcome. This is the fun stuff. This is where you operationalize. We often have companies that do hundreds of process steps, and when really they only need to do a couple steps. So sustainability, which is a really important element, is an ongoing effort that can happen at your fingertips in minutes, and not month-long projects that are stale once you get them completed. You can bring a supplier up to supplying instantly, sharing the right data, provision that right data with them instantly, not wondering if you're handing them off the right spreadsheet, the right sample, or the right email. You could look for opportunities throughout your whole organization to limit or narrow down your SKUs. There's something we've created like a like item finder. But once you have a common language, you can run analytics through that common language or that common digitized spec constantly. Ultimately, operationalizing is changing now that you have data in front of you and the things and the way you do it. It's like if we don't do that, it's like having an old rotary phone and trying to act like we have an iPhone. The two don't match. So you have to understand, once you've digitized it, put in the language of computers, how do you act differently with that data? Some great use cases we'll spend a minute on. So Corteva, formerly Dow, understood that they needed to do something because they had, obviously, as we would understand, great supplier regulatory issues. The other thing they were trying to do was consolidate items, make them more simple to get to market. And so what we saw, several great examples that they came from, but you see 77 different pallet kind of configurations came down to 19 by standardizing the data and allowing the data to look similar. The other thing that happened, and if you hear them speak about digitization and bringing their stuff into a specification management platform, is that they were able to do things in 4 or 5 steps that historically took them hundreds of process steps and months to get a new product to market. So you see something like Ag Chem in Corteva, flipping the side to cosmetics, a company out of Sweden. They really looked at this years ago as building their digitization database to really become a sustainable company. And now with EPR really around them, it really has been very timely. So they've been able to have now years of tracked history of the digitized product and what it means from a standpoint of sustainability. They've been able to report on that and provide that reporting not as an event, but an ongoing daily opportunity. So as we think through everything we just talked about today, step 1 is digitization. You have to pull all the data that may sit in silos, different people's operating systems, perhaps your vendors, and you have to have a way in a schema to bring that data to one central language. Don't create different languages. Use the templated language system that's out there. Then you want to operationalize it. Then you want to map it. And that means you want to create logic amongst the specs. So you know where a spec is used or specs that are impacted by changes. Then you want to operationalize it and get the best outcomes, such as I just shared 2 different examples with you. And then ultimately, we'll talk about networking another day. But that is where you can avail your data on a network and share data and provision data to outside suppliers and partners in your ecosphere. So today has never been a better day to digitize and to get data. There's so much unlocked and rich data in the packaging world that will empower us to have many things that people are looking for in AI, creating products out of logic that should understanding testing, understanding the sustainability and impact of things and the changes you make. Things will continue to evolve through the supply chain, sustainability, regulatory, and the only way we can adapt and address that is through data. And data has to be given by digitizing first. And so I'd encourage you to really sit back and think about that. And we are obviously here and others to help you through that journey. As Jill mentioned, I had an opportunity to sit down and write a book. It's a story that most of you will understand and relate to. It's really the convening of products and packaging together. Never do I think has there been a more exciting time in the packaging space than today. Packaging is rising in importance in every organization and operation, and getting product to market and really selling that product. What a better time than now to create data for your packaging and be robust and for the future ahead of us. Jill, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. That was awesome. So we're pivoting into the question and answer portion now. So feel free to drop any questions you have in the question box, and I'll go ahead and go through them. One I got directly was, Matthew, so the pandemic pushed a large and sudden need for packaging and supply chain digitization. Do you think that will die down once we're no longer in a global pandemic state?
It's, Jill, thank you for the question. It's a great question, as I have an opportunity to sit upon hundreds of companies all challenged with the supply chain. I get this question a lot. When will the supply chain challenges settle down? What does the future look like? And I would tell you that I think it's not going to settle down. There's going to continue to be more and more challenges as the world moves forward. And really on two fronts, both from a supply standpoint, a logistics standpoint. The world is getting larger, population, and ultimately the demand and the desire to be more sustainable. So I envision a world that's even more complex than today. And therefore, I envision a world that we have to use data to solve our problems.
Right, right. Here's another one. What are some of the biggest struggles global packaging companies face that spec management and supply chain digitization are helping?
I think that's a great question. Today, we're global. All companies are global, taking the taste around the world or the experience around the world. And what's interesting about that is the world is still very myopic. It's even in domestically in the United States or other countries, everybody looks at sustainability and regulatory differently. And so I look at that as a lens of questions upon data. So if you have your data set, you can then throw the lenses of countries, states, regions, and geography against that spec to see what needs to change or what ultimately needs to be altered. And then also look at putting logic over that data that says, if you do certain things, it will not be able to be shipped into these countries or used in this country. And then lastly, we see EPRs, really a very meaningful tool that countries are now starting to use to penalize companies that don't understand their data.
Awesome, awesome. And what do you think the future of packaging digitization looks like over the next decade?
It's the most exciting time I think ever in packaging. I think that some of the conversations I'm having are really, smart products created from data, logical, parsed up information to you. Would you like to create this type of product? Or if you did this to this product, this would be the outcome. Data is so rich everywhere else in the world, in the industry and consumer applications. Bringing that to packaging, we're going to see some amazing outcomes over the next decade.
Great. And another one just came in. So is the standard EPCIS 2.0 needed, or are there other ways going forward?
Yeah, so we've got a minute left. That's a challenging question. I think there's so much to be learned yet. I think that what we need to do, and I know we're doing this with some just different advisory boards around the world, is really starting to understand all those requirements, understand which ones really do make sense and work together, and which ones work against each other. And again, I think you've heard me say this a million times, Jill, we need a lot of smart people at the table to really understand the global footprint and the industry footprint and how the two can come together. So I think that's yet to be figured out.
All right, and we've got 1 minute remaining, so I'll go ahead and wrap it up. Any other questions, feel free to drop them in the question box and we'll get back to you via email. Other than that, thank you all for attending and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your time.